Well, welcome again to our Tuesday evening teaching sessions, an opportunity to think about Scripture and the way that it's formed and shaped and its key elements, the message that it's trying to tell us. Over these weeks, we've been looking at Genesis chapter 1 through to Genesis chapter 11, and we've still got a little way to go. But for the moment, we've been focusing in on a particular approach, and that approach is to ask the question, what exactly is the author trying to tell us? What was the author's intention? That isn't, of course, to dismiss all the controversy and debate that goes on around Genesis chapter 1 through to 11. It's important to acknowledge that, and of course, if our focus was elsewhere, we would be looking at that. But for the moment, we're just narrowing things down, and we're trying to almost get back to the authenticity of the message of the author as it was set out at the time that these stories were collected and written down. So we're really just asking fundamental questions about exactly what the author is trying to tell us. In our last session, session 8, we looked at Genesis chapter 6 and verse 9 through to Genesis chapter 7 and verse 24. And of course, the author there, I think, was trying to ask some important questions to help us think through some important questions. The first one would obviously be, what kind of God does this sort of thing as we enter into the story of the flood? Why was that action necessary? Why had God felt that there was no alternative to the flood, to the action that he's about to take? Where is there despair in this particular story? And indeed, where could we find hope within it? How does this story connect with all that has gone on before in the earlier chapters of Genesis? And how will it lead us into the future chapters, the chapters yet to come, that we still need to address in our particular sessions? I guess the author really wants to tell us something about the nature of God's judgments, also to explore with us God's heart for salvation, and of course that remnant, the preservation of a remnant through whom God would continue to work out his story of salvation. And so I guess we were exploring quite a number of key issues within the whole of Scripture. The nature of God, the revelation of God, the nature of his salvation, and the processes of his salvation, the way that God has worked through a remnant of people. Today we're going to complete the story, well, almost complete the story of Noah. We're going to look at Genesis chapter 8 through to chapter 9, and we're going to stop at verse 17. And I'm going to read that for you today. Beginning with Genesis chapter 8. But God remembered Noah and all the wild animals and the livestock that were with him in the ark. And he sent a wind over the earth, and the waters receded. Now the springs of the deep and the floodgates of the heavens had been closed, and the rain had stopped falling from the sky. The water receded steadily from the earth. At the end of the 150 days, the water had gone down. And on the 17th day of the 7th month, the ark came to rest on the mountain of Ararat. The waters continued to recede until the 10th month, and on the first day of the 10th month, the tops of the mountains became visible. After 40 days, Noah opened the window he had made in the ark and sent out a raven, and it kept flying back and forth until the waters had dried up from the earth. Then he sent out a dove to see if the waters had receded from the surface of the ground. But the dove could find no place to set its feet because there was water over the surface of the earth. So it returned to Noah and to the ark. He reached out his hand and took the dove and brought it back to himself in the ark. He waited 7 more days and sent out the dove from the ark. When the dove returned to him in the evening, there in its beak was a freshly plucked olive leaf. Then Noah knew that the waters had receded from the earth. He waited 7 more days and sent the dove out again, but this time it did not return to him. By the first day of the first month of Noah's 601st year, the waters had dried up from the earth. Noah then removed the covering from the ark and saw that the surface of the ground was dry. By the 27th day of the second month, the earth was completely dry. Then God said to Noah, "Come out of the ark, you and your wife and your sons and their wives. Bring out every kind of living creature that is with you, the birds, the animals, and all the creatures that move along the ground, so that they can multiply on the earth and be fruitful and increase in number upon it." So Noah came out together with his sons and his wife and his sons' wives. All the animals and all the creatures that move along the ground and all the birds, everything that moves on the earth came out of the ark, one kind after another. Then Noah built an altar to the Lord, and taking some of the clean animals and clean birds, he sacrificed a burnt offering on it. The Lord smelled the pleasing aroma and said in his heart, "Never again will I curse the ground because of man, even though every inclination of his heart is evil from childhood. Never again will I destroy all living creatures as I have done. As long as the earth endures, seedtime and harvest, cold and heat, summer and winter, day and night will never cease." Then God blessed Noah and his sons, saying to them, "Be fruitful and increase in numbers and fill the earth. The fear and dread of you will fall upon the beasts of the earth and all the birds of the air, upon every creature that moves along the ground, and upon all the fish of the sea. They are given into your hands. Everything that lives and moves will be food for you. Just as I gave you green plants, I now give you everything. But you must not eat meat that has its lifeblood still in it. And for your lifeblood I will surely demand an accounting. I will demand an accounting from every animal. And from each man too I will demand an accounting for the life of his fellow man. Whoever sheds the blood of man, by man shall his blood be shed. For he is the image of God, and God made man. As for you, be fruitful and increase in number. Multiply on the earth and increase it." Then God said to Noah and his sons, "I now establish my covenant with you and with your descendants after you, and with every living creature that was with you, the birds, the livestock, all the wild animals, all that came out of the ark with you, every living creature on earth. I establish my covenant with you. Never again will all life be cut off by the waters of a flood. Never again will there be flood to destroy the earth." And God said, "This is a sign of the covenant I am making between me and you, and every living creature with you, a covenant for all generations to come. I have set my rainbow in the clouds, and it will be a sign of the covenant between me and the earth. Whenever I bring clouds over the earth and the rainbows appear in the clouds, I will remember my covenant between me and you and all living creatures of every kind. Never again will the waters become a flood to destroy all earth. Whenever the rainbow appears in the clouds, I will see it and remember the everlasting covenant between God and all living creatures of every kind on earth." So God said to Noah, "This is the sign of the covenant I have established between me and all life on earth. That was a long reading. Thank you for staying with that, if you managed to. As we said in our previous conversations, the central point, the focus of the whole story of Noah and the flood is found in chapter 8 and verse 1. It brings us to the defining moment of that particular narrative technique that our author has been using, a palistrophe. The words, "but God remembered Noah," are absolutely central to the whole understanding of this particular story. And the author really wants us to grasp that. He's deliberately set out to reinforce that in our thinking. Not in the sense, of course, that God had forgotten Noah. The author, I think, is simply telling us that God is about to act on Noah's behalf. What has been taking place will now be reversed. And that's why the author has used a palistrophe, because, of course, that's its formation. It starts, it unfolds a story in a sequence, it reaches its climatic moment, and then it goes almost into reverse, and it takes us back out of the story. And of course, that's exactly what this story is all about. If the first section that we looked at last week is about decreation, then of course this section is truly about recreation. Not total, because as we've observed before, the heavens, the sky remain intact, but the impact on earth is massive. And so we've seen the decreation of earth, and now we will see the recreation of earth. Just as in the beginning, when we read, or the author wants us to understand that God, in a sense, calls the waters into some sense of order. He creates boundaries, creates the sea, and he creates the dry land. So we see that happening again here. As the story now moves on from chapter 8, verse 1, we see God beginning to call the waters back into some sort of order state, those boundaries that are set by God. Dry land is about to return. And God, of course, is committed to the outcome of that. And not just for this moment that we find here, the author telling us this most amazing story, but for all time. This is God commanding his creation to set boundaries on its destructive intents. And of course, that is significant both in the past, but also in our world today. One of the key elements that we find here in chapter 8 through to chapter 9 is, of course, that important topic or subject of covenant. As the author is writing and his listeners are reading his story or listening to his story, of course, their understanding of covenant is central to the understanding of their own relationship with God. They see the recreation that's taken place here as the origins of God's covenant relationship, not just with Noah and his sons, although it begins in that particular format. But the author's intention at this point is to show us that the covenant that is being established here is not just for Noah and his sons, but it's for their descendants, and it's for all descendants. It's for all people everywhere. And not just people. The boundaries of the covenant go way beyond that, and in fact include all living creatures. The covenant that we are introduced to in chapter 6 and verse 18, which was really the author telling us this is the agreement, this is the assurance that Noah and his family are going to need, because they will be entombed in the ark for this period of time, is now brought to a greater completion as we find it in chapter 9. Firstly, as part of that covenant, there is that sense of God's blessing. And again, we find those words that we've discovered earlier on in the early chapters of Genesis, where Noah and his sons and the family, their wives, are told to be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth. So again, that reconnects this story that we have here with those earlier stories in the book of Genesis. The commission stays the same, the blessing of continuity, and of course, responsibility that comes with that. But the context has changed from the early chapters of Genesis, when the humans were, not just humans, but all of creation was encouraged to be fruitful and to multiply. The context at that time in the early chapters was within the garden. We're no longer in the garden, and although the commission is the same, the context in which that commission is to be worked out has, of course, changed. This is life outside of the garden. And life outside of the garden, as we see in chapter 8, is where every inclination of the heart is evil from childhood. So God is committing himself now to work in a world to bring about his faithful covenant promises and bring them to completion, but in a very different kind of world. A world that is so different from the one that he envisioned in those early chapters of Genesis. Some see this as a declaration of God's creative intentions having to be readjusted and replaced by what some writers or scholars call his provisional will. This is a temporary measure. God is about to work in a very different context, and that is a provisional understanding, because ultimately God will restore all things back to himself when time is no more. So all his covenant declarations are set in the context of a world that is largely out of tune with God's heart and his intentions. So this is a deeply significant commitment that God is making to work with the world as it now is. One of the great themes that the author moves on to explore in this particular section is the theme of the sanctity of life. From the moment of exile, we've seen that the value of human life seems to be diminishing verse by verse. Not in God's sight, of course, but in the way that humans are responding to each other. And now the author wants to tell us that God is really engaging in a process of seeking to bring back human values, the way that humans value life, the gift of life. He's in a long process of bringing it back to where it needs to be. And what we draw out here is the author's understanding, the intention of the author to remind us that human life is sacred. And the reason why it's sacred is, of course, because it bears the image of God. Human life is to be protected. And of course, because of that, there needs to be some consequences to anyone who goes against the sanctity of life, who takes another person's life. Now, I don't think the author at this particular moment is trying to tell us that God's ideal intention is that capital punishment should be the right punishment for the taking of somebody's life. I think the author is just saying we're in a process here, and what God is doing at this moment is putting a halt to that indiscriminate taking of life that was so often acted out in revenge. So in other words, if a person took someone's life, then within the tribal context in which that had happened, the family of the one who had lost his life would then come along and take many, many lives in retribution, in revenge. And what we find here is almost this concept beginning to evolve of a life for a life. So the life for the life principle is really not to say that's the best way of doing things, but just simply to say that at least this draws a line in the sand to stop that indiscriminate revenge, which would result in so many other deaths. Not only that, but I think here we're seeing the author helping the reader, the listener, to begin to understand that what we see here is something of the structures that will enable society to grow and to emerge as we see it unfolding in the biblical narrative. Here is the concept of fair judgment and the way that society will be able to measure a sense of equality between the crime and the punishment. And already you see that early understanding of how society is going to be able to function best beginning to emerge. The sanctity of life that we find here not only covers human life, but interestingly enough, covers animal life. Of course, God here is giving his permission for the taking of the life of an animal as a source of food. But what is being said here is that just killing for the sake of killing is not God's intention. And even animal life and bird life, although it becomes open to become that source of food, it's not meant to be a go-ahead to just simply destroy animal life and bird life and the creatures that crawl on the earth and so on in some kind of indiscriminate way. So you can see what's unfolding here is deeply significant in the way that we both value human life and the life of the created world. Both of those are at the heart of what the author is telling us here, right from the very setting out of this whole new world that will emerge out of this process of recreation. And finally, alongside that, we also see here the author, remember he's talking to an audience much later on from this original the context for this original story that he's set it within. And what we find here is that the value of and the sanctity of human blood, and not just human blood, but the blood of all creatures, is really being re-emphasized. When Noah comes out of the ark, he makes a sacrifice. So we see here the early elements of the sacrificial system and the sacrifice that would bring about the offering of blood as being within the whole fabric and life of the nation of Israel. So right from this early story, we find that being set out for us. The author's intention is to say to his generation, this is where it comes from, and this is why it is so important. Finally today, I just wanted to reflect on the rainbow. The rainbow is introduced here as the symbol of covenant commitment. I don't think the author is suggesting that there were no rainbows before this moment. And what is interesting is that actually, if you go back into the original Hebrew language, which of course is the language in which the author is writing, what you find here is that the Hebrew phrase for which we translate rainbow is actually more a warrior's bow. It's almost as if the author is telling us that God, in this image of God as a warrior, is setting aside his bow of judgment. It's being placed in the clouds, as it were. It will no longer be used as a weapon to bring about judgment on the earth. Again, of course, God doesn't need the rainbow to remind himself of his covenant commitments. It's just as we saw with that moment when in chapter 8 and verse 1 where Noah is remembered. Well, it's not that God is forgetful, it's just simply saying that God is going to act on his covenant commitment, which is visible for us through the rainbow. And that's, I think, what the author is just simply trying to tell us. God will not flood the earth again. Life in all its forms will not be destroyed. There will be continuity now, no matter how often his creation comes under threat. God is committed to his world and to working with his world just as it is, following on from the story of the flood and the ark. And of course, as the rainbow is featured here, it remains that symbol of God's grace and his provision. No matter how the future is going to unfold, the author wants to tell us that God will remain faithful to his promises. And it's God's grace that will now meet the corruption that will mark human existence and, of course, counter the human problem of sin.